In this video, I'll take you through 4 quick actionable tips to instantly improve any design. We'll use this bad card design as an example, using these steps to make a bad design look professional. Tip number 1 is color reduction. The first area to look at in your project is the use of color. And really the main focus here and the secret tip is, can you reduce the color? I see this a lot in beginner designers, but using lots and lots of colors. When they're looking for a solution, it's add more colors to make it work. But really, we want to see what we can take away. Trust me, it will actually make a huge difference. I think a great starting point, and what I personally do, is I start all my designs really just using white, black, and gray as the base, and then bringing in a main brand color to add a little bit of a pop. But really the majority of your designs are going to be based around that white, black, and gray as a starting point. It's best not to actually start with your brand color. As you can see here, our brand color is yellow. And if we use that as the basis, you can see how overwhelming it is already. That's why you should start with a white or a simple color like that. And it's best to use your brand color, like yellow as an example, or whatever your brand color is, as highlights to add little pops of color and bring that brand identity into it in the right spots. With our mock project, it's an easy win. Take that yellow background color and change that to white straight away. We will need to add a little bit of a drop shadow to this to help with legibility, but let's get back to that later. We'll just put a pin in that one for now. Now let's change the type all to a standard black. I like to use this hex value as a starting point. So change all your text to this color so it feels consistent. And now as you can see here, if we want to actually add a little bit of hierarchy in this already, as it's consistent when it's all black, but the hierarchy isn't as good. So instead of adding a brand new color or adding a yellow, let's look at adding some tints and shades to our blacks and our grays, and we'll pull those colors into it instead of adding just a brand new color. This is a great way of starting designs. Instead of just adding new colors, just look at what tints and shades you can use for now. This is what a lot of the professional designers do. If you look at a lot of big products, like Airbnb as an example, they're not using heaps of different colors. They're using a lot of blacks and grays, and that helps a heap with the hierarchy and the readability of it. I feel like that's looking better already, but now that we've finished step 1 of color, let's move on to the second step, which is typography. So next up we have typography. Now this whole video could just be around typography, and maybe we'll go into that in another video, but here we're looking at quick actionable tips. So first thing we want to look through with this is how many fonts are actually getting used. So really, let's try to make all the fonts part of the same font family. There is cases when you get a little bit more experience where you can kind of balance maybe a serif and a sans serif, and they can kind of pair together and work nicely. But for this one, let's all make them the same sans serif for now. Whichever typography you use, you can explore in there within different font weightings if you feel like the hierarchy isn't working. But I'd say start with everything being the same weight of normal and see how that kind of feels. So let's change it in our mock design. As we have all these different crazy fonts going on at the moment, let's make them all part of the same font family to start with. Now that we've made them all part of the same font family, let's fix up the sizing. So think about what the first thing you want your user to read. Is it the heading, or is it who wrote it, or which piece of item is it? You should pretty much know this. This is a pretty standard question to ask. And once you know that, you can kind of work easily with, if you know that's the first thing that you want people to read, you probably want that a little bit bigger. These aren't always the same rules for everything. When you get a bit more experience, there is more room for wiggle. But for right now, let's set up some standard sizing so the hierarchy feels nice and consistent and easy to scan. Now that we've finished typography, let's wrap this together with spacing and padding. Now we're on to spacing and padding. Now these words are going to feel a bit jargony at first, but they're really important to learn. If you're going to work in the world of UI or website or product design or development, you need to know what these things mean and understand them. Now I'll try to explain it as simple as I can and use this diagram to help explain it. So the padding is the space inside an element, like the space between the content and the edge of a button or a box. Think of it as the breathing room around the text or images within the element. And now spacing, or margin, is the space outside an element, like the gap between one card and another card. It's what separates different elements on the page. But it can also be within the same space, like the space between our heading and our paragraph in our card. I hope that's a little bit more clear now. Spacing is really good at grouping things together and helping things kind of feel like they're within the same family. So if you move the proximity of things closer together, they feel grouped. So when you look at our card as an example, nothing really feels grouped together. Everything kind of feels spaced out. It just feels a bit weird and it just doesn't logically flow as I try to read it and look at it. This kind of feels like balance sometimes. If it looks balanced or it doesn't look balanced, this could be with if the spacing or padding feels right. If you're new to the world of UI, product, website, or any of those things, is stick to a 16 pixel formula. So a heap of big businesses and designers that I've worked with or I've looked up to, they use this as a starting point. And with all these tips, this isn't some hard and fast, everyone has to do this rule, but I think this is a great starting point. And this is something that I still use as a starting point, and then you can flex it a little bit when you know the right moments too. Now with that, let's go through and tidy up our card. First off, let's go through the padding. This feels way too large. So let's tighten it up and see if that feels a little bit better. And now let's fix up the spacing. So if you, as I said before, if you want objects to complement each other or to be grouped with other items, for example, we want this title and intro text, we want those to be visually together. So we will move those items closer together so they feel visually grouped. As well as the name, title, and image down the bottom, they make sense to be a group as well. Now let's look into these items a little bit closer and see if they can follow that 16 pixel rule that I talked about before. Now if we look at that, it feels like there is grouping established. It doesn't feel too spaced out on the side, and it's much easier to scan and really read the items. Can you see with a few small changes, it actually made this card so much easier to read? Like when we grouped the name and the image down the bottom, you automatically started looking at that as one little group of, oh, that's that person's name. That actually makes sense to read that together. All right, now the last tip. This one I think is the hardest one to master, but with some ways to kind of look at it, it actually is possible. And if you keep working on it, you'll be surprised how actionable it actually is. And it makes a huge difference. So now this is the art of being subtle. So this is the point that I mentioned before about the drop shadow, but we'll jump back into it. This is where we're jumping back into it. I could make a whole video of how important learning the art of being subtle actually is. And I think this is a bigger skill that keeps getting refined as you grow as a designer. And the thing that's a bit tricky about this one is that there isn't as hard and fast rules that you can kind of follow, but there is a few things that I've picked up along the way that I think you can use as a starting point. So for example, that drop shadow is way too strong. You can look at that and know that that feels too heavy straight away. And as we said before, the goal of the drop shadow is to get help with readability. But right now it's actually overwhelming the design. Because we want the focus to be actually on the card, the drop shadow should just be complementing it. So let's knock that back a little bit so that it's still nice and readable, but isn't taking away from the design. So that's drop shadows. Another area you can look into is corner radius. So right now we have quite sharp corners. So depending on the type of design you have, you might want these really rounded to fit the branding that you're going for, or slightly rounded. I think a great starting point is just round them a little bit. It will take the edge off the design and it will make it a bit softer and actually feel a bit more professional. And then from there you can play around a bit of, does it need to go more round, does it need to go less round? But I think 2 to 8 pixels is a great starting point. Another area as well, instead of using a drop shadow, if you're not using that in your design, look at maybe a really gentle border. Same as before though, we don't want this to overwhelm, we just really want it to help with readability. So keep it subtle. And just think as you're designing, is this overwhelming the user or is this aiding them? If the goal is to make the card more readable, they shouldn't get distracted by a border. So now that we've gone through those 4 steps and we look at the before to the after, we can see how we've massively improved the design in just a few simple steps. And then at this point, I think this is where it gets fun. So you followed the 4 steps, you've taken your card from looking pretty terrible to actually not half bad, and you followed those steps. And then this is the fun thing about design, is that now that you have these kind of standards set up, that you can go further, you can start exploring. So what other things can you look at? You can play around with, do you want to make the design really focused on the rounded corners here and make the image and the button really pressed up to the side and then bring the content in? After looking at it, do you realize that this button's actually way too black and maybe you want to push that back a little bit and then flip the text to dark? Or do you not like that button? Do you want to look at something else? Maybe something a little bit more subtle, like this text only with an arrow icon. Do you want to get rid of the background completely? Do you want to get rid of the drop shadow and the border and have a much more subtle card like this? And this is the fun part about design, is that we can cut this so many different ways. And all these cards look good for their own reasons, but this is where you start really pushing it. So you've got the 4 basics of how to take it from bad to good. And now this is where you can just keep pushing it and changing it in different ways. And this is really where you can refine your craft as a designer and take that to the next level. Now, some things to check to see if your design feels improved. Can you easily tell what's important just at a glance by looking at the card? Are the colors simplified? Did you base your design in grays, whites, and blacks? I think one that people miss out on as well is it legible and accessible. We can make really great designs and they can still be accessible. Accessibility is more than just the color. At this point, it's worth checking. Is all the text legible? Are all the color contrast passing at least AA standard? Are the elements large enough for easy clickability? All right, now that we've covered those steps, you should be able to easily follow this to take a bad looking design and make it feel much more professional. Give it a try. I'd love to see what you do. Even just start with one step. Can you reduce the color on your design to help improve it? If you found this one helpful, drop a like and subscribe for more design tips. And let me know in the comments down below, which design tip did you find most useful